We are going to tell you the story of a ship that was built by this man, Brunel. It's an extraordinary story, and none of it would have happened if it hadn't been for the genius of this engineer. It really begins in 1838, when Brunel and the Great Western Steamship Company announced that they were going to build a second ship to travel between Great Britain and America. They built a special dry dock here in Bristol, and in 1839 they started to build the biggest, the fastest, and the most unusual ship that had ever been conceived. By July 1843 she was ready to launch. Imagine, if you can, what amazement the population of Bristol must have felt when they saw for the first time this giant ship completed, 320 feet long and almost 3,000 tons. But before we tell you the most extraordinary things about the construction of the Great Britain, because that was and still is her name, let's look at what happened at her launch. Thousands of people turned out, and a great number of them paid a guinea to see the launch, attend a royal banquet, and watch Prince Albert himself take part in the ceremony from a specially constructed pagoda. In fact, she wasn't as much launched as floated. When the water had been let into the dock and the ship was floating inside, the tug started pulling, the rope broke, the lady performing the ceremony dropped her champagne bottle in the water, and Prince Albert saved the day by throwing a reserve bottle and hitting the bow with a resounding crash from 20 feet. The prince then went back to the station, and by the time they finally got the ship out of the dock, he was halfway back to London. In fact, what with one thing and another, the whole operation was something of a shambles. Luckily, they didn't try to take her down the river that day, because as it turned out, the hull was built 5 feet 6 inches wider than the opening through the dock, and it took nearly 6 months to release her.
I'm Queen of the Waters. The ocean world has never yet seen a sail unfurled like mine o'er its billowy heaving breast, or seabird that carried a prouder crest.
What they were celebrating at their banquet, though they didn't know it, was the construction of the first real Atlantic liner. She was covered in gold leaf and decoration, which was all very impressive. But what was so remarkable about the Great Britain was not only that she was the biggest ship in the world, but that Brunel had decided to build her out of iron, and her engine was connected not to paddles, but to a screw. These 4 cylinders were no less than 6 feet 8 inches in diameter. They were connected to a wrought iron crankshaft, turning a drum over 18 feet across, which connected to the propeller shaft by 4 endless chains. The engine itself weighed 340 tons, and the engine and boiler room together were 117 feet long. There had never been anything like her before. She had a promenade deck built under cover so that the passengers could walk about without getting battered by wind and waves. She had a great gallery with windows let into the stern of the ship. Her staterooms accommodated 360 passengers, and her dining hall was, by shipping standards, nothing short of sumptuous. Luckily, this man, Fox Talbot, considered it worthwhile to take his newly invented camera all the way to Bristol and photograph her while she was being fitted out. Remember when you look at this photograph that it was taken 126 years ago, when her engines were actually being fitted. This picture has become enormously valuable, particularly to one man. He is a naval architect, and he knows more about the way the Great Britain was built than any other man living. His name is Dr. Ewan Corlett.
This ship really could be said to set the pace for shipbuilding for 100 years to come. Of course, as a naval architect, I was well aware of this. The thought struck me suddenly, why should we not do something about her? Why should we not check what condition she is, lying as she is, a hulk in the Falkland Islands? Can we bring her home? At any rate, let us find out and document the ship for posterity so that the details of her design, the details of construction, how Brunel conceived the ship will be known for all time.
This is a model of the Great Britain built by Vickers Armstrong so that they could test the hull and measure its performance in a tank. Look at the clipper bow. It was the first ever built quite that shape. As Dr. Corlett and the scientists discovered, The hull is very efficient indeed. And remember, there was no such thing as tank testing in 1840. The shipbuilder who actually drew her lines was working purely on experience and the classic rule that what looks right, works right. Her shape was the only thing that Brunel didn't work on. The hull that they tested was drawn up by a man called Patterson, and you only have to look at the bow to see that she was built for speed. She had the first large screw propeller and the first simplex rudder, built exactly like modern rudders are today. Vickers also tested the screw and the rudder with scale models, again working in the tank. The propeller weighed 4 tons. The 6 flat wrought iron blades were almost 16 feet in diameter. Not very efficient, but as nobody knew anything about propellers in those days, the amazing thing is not that it didn't work well, but that it managed to work at all. And work it did. In January 1845, the Great Britain steamed out of Bristol with her 6 masts and her distinguished passengers, straight into the teeth of a gale. Where most other ships would have broken up, she merely had a couple of plates buckled in the bow and steamed on. Despite the weather, she made 12.5 knots with her engine turning at 19 revolutions a minute. She arrived in London to a hero's welcome. She was visited by the Queen, and she stayed to bask in the glory for 5 months, before setting out on her maiden voyage to Liverpool and on to New York. We don't know how many passengers she carried, because the log of that first voyage has been lost. But we do know that burning between 70 and 80 tons of coal a day, she ploughed on, rolling badly and vibrating dramatically through strong headwinds. She covered 3,300 miles in 14 days and 21 hours at an average speed of just over 9 knots. As she steamed up the East River at New York, she was the first screw-driven ship ever to have made an ocean voyage. She was a success, and her return voyage to Liverpool was completed without any trouble whatsoever. But there was one big problem which nobody realized. The blades on her propeller were working loose. On her next voyage, they started to come off one by one. Eventually, on the way home from New York, she lost 5 blades out of 6 and limped home with 1. They decided to fit her with a new 4-bladed propeller and change her rig from 6 masts to 5. Away she went on 2 more round trips from Liverpool to New York and back again. It was the 5th voyage that turned out to be disaster. Her captain mistook a lighthouse in bad weather, and she went aground on a beach at Dundrum Bay in Northern Ireland. There was talk of abandoning her as a total write-off, but Brunel himself was determined to save her. He wrote to the owners.
The finest ship in the world has been left and is lying like a useless saucepan kicking about on the most exposed shore that you can imagine, with no more effort or skill applied to protect the property than the said saucepan would have received on the beach at Brighton. It is really shocking.
Brunel designed a breakwater made out of faggots to protect the ship during the winter, and despite the most terrible storms, it worked. In the spring, there began the most complicated and tortuous salvage operation to lift her out of the sand and repair her bottom before the high spring tides could lift her and float her over the rocks that surround the beach. They eventually managed it, but the Great Western Steamship Company went broke in the process, and when the Great Britain sailed again, she had been sold to new owners. Gibbs, Bright and Company gave her new engines, 2 funnels, took away another mast, and prepared her for the run between Liverpool and Australia. She had been refitted with no expense spared. The old saloon was turned into cargo space, and a new deckhouse was built to provide for the 730 passengers. It was comfortable enough, so long as everybody stuck to the rules.
Breakfast to be at 8 o'clock, and at 9 the cloth to be removed, after which nothing will be served. Passengers are requested to allow ladies to occupy the seats most convenient for retiring from the dinner table.
In 1852, she set out on the long voyage to Australia. Everyone, including the newspapers, was confident of her success.
The Great Britain is fully equipped to resist any attempt to attack the vessel, for she is mounted with 6 heavy guns and arms and ammunition for 100 men. It is confidently expected that she will reach Melbourne in 56 days, whereas double that time is considered average for a sailing vessel.
In fact, as her log shows, it took her 82 days because she ran out of coal halfway through the voyage. This first trip to Melbourne was the start of 25 years ploughing backwards and forwards between Britain and Australia. Apart from carrying troops to the Crimea and reinforcements to quell the Indian Mutiny, she visited Sydney so regularly that she became part of the local scene. Her master, Captain Grey, decided to cut her down to 3 masts instead of 4, and complete with her own newspaper, she made 32 runs to Australia before she was finally retired and laid up in Liverpool. But it wasn't the end, not quite. She was sold after 5 years' idleness for £6,500. It was in 1882 when her new owners removed her engines altogether, rigged her as a pure sailing ship and fitted her as a cargo boat. For some reason, they covered her hull in wood, though nobody knows why. In 1886, she started her last voyage to San Francisco, carrying coal. She never arrived. She was damaged in a storm rounding Cape Horn and put back for repairs to the Falkland Islands. In Port Stanley, although the damage turned out to be little more than a strained deck, it was decided to write her off as a dead loss. Why they did this is still something of a mystery, but whatever the reason, she was sold to the Falkland Islands Company as a hulk and stripped down to become a storehouse for coal and wool. They stripped her of anything valuable they could lay their hands on. They sold her sails and her rigging, and they cut great holes in her starboard side so that the bales of wool could be loaded on and off without difficulty. It was a sad-looking ship that lay in Port Stanley, and a miserable job for an historic ship like the Great Britain. She stayed here for 47 years until her decks began to leak and there was no use left in her even as a hulk. So they brought tugs and they towed her out of Port Stanley. They took her round the coast to a place called Sparrow Cove, and here they found a piece of beach and they ran her ashore. She was supposed to rust away and fall apart like any other wreck. They banged holes in her stern so that she would sink once and for all and settle in the sand. And that, they thought, was that. But it wasn't. 34 years later, in 1968, she was still there. In this open bay, where all the weather from the Atlantic had swept in year after year, Brunel's construction had held up and survived. For years, visitors looked at that beautiful bow, still majestic even without its bowsprit, and they said, what a pity to leave her there to rot. And some said, why can't she be saved? And nobody did anything, and she went on rotting, though some of her figurehead remained. Her 3 great masts stood towering up, and great areas of her deck had either rotted or been taken away and used for building. Her deck winches were still there, rusted up, but as sound as the day they were built. One of her yards still hung from her mainmast, and her frames were still in place, just as the shipwrights had cut them out in 1839 by laboriously drilling hole after hole. All very well to dream of bringing her back to Britain, but when you look at the desolation that time, men and weather had caused, it makes you think that only a fanatical romantic would have the courage actually to try. No decks left at all inside. Nothing but a mass of rusty iron girders, crisscrossing and marking out in space the areas where top-hatted gentlemen and crinolined ladies strolled arm in arm to work up an appetite for dinner. Not so much as a cabin wall or a door to show where the first-class staterooms were, and even the windows in the great stern gallery boarded up, where the ladies would sit and sew and gaze out at the long, straight line of her wake. And yet, looking at this hull with this magnificent stern, There were some people who thought that it wasn't an impossible task to bring her home and save her from this final stage of decay. This crack in her side was the biggest problem, caused mainly by the hole cut in her side so that she could be loaded easily as a hulk. Only nobody could tell how bad the crack was and how far under the water it went. In fact, the problems of bringing the ship home were enormous, and nobody even knew what half these problems were. In the winter of 1968, this ship arrived in Port Stanley. HMS Endurance is a naval hydrographic ship. It was Dr. Corlett's plan, with the help given by the Royal Navy, to carry out a survey and see if indeed it was possible to bring the Great Britain home. HMS Endurance carried all the men and all the equipment necessary to survey not only the ship, but also the waters of Sparrow Cove. It was no good planning how to salvage the ship if there wasn't enough depth of water to get the salvage equipment alongside. Equally, it was no good sending expensive equipment all the way to the Falkland Islands if the ship was too far gone ever to float again. At first sight, neither the bay nor the ship itself looked particularly hopeful. They started work in the grey Atlantic mist, sending divers down to look at the hull and inspect every inch of rusting iron that they could reach. The crew of Endurance found that the only chart of Sparrow Cove had been made sometime in the last century by the crew of a visiting sailing ship, so they simply set to and made a completely new survey. One thing was abundantly obvious. This was not the place that anyone would have chosen to carry out any kind of salvage.
Stand by. Are you ready? Ready. Fix.
In the end, they decided that there was enough water to float the ship, and it would be possible to tow her out, if she could be made to float. And here again, the surveyors and the divers decided that it might be possible to make her float, and there was a chance of closing the crack in her hull, just as long as the damage didn't get any worse. But it was here in England that the plan was finally worked out. This is Basingstoke, where Dr. Corlett has his office, and where he works as a regular marine architect, quite apart from his interest in the Great Britain. Two things were required: a plan to make the salvage possible, and secondly, an organisation to manage the whole operation and raise a lot of money.
It remains now to effect the actual salvage of the vessel. We have carried out a preliminary or a feasibility survey, which was moderately encouraging, and thanks to the generosity of many individuals and concerns, we have the necessary finance.
This is Jack Hayward. He has provided the Great Britain project with enough money to bring the ship home.
Well, I first saw it in the press. I think it was the Times. I think it was a letter to the Times. I think all these things start with letters to the Times, all these crusades. Then they ran a leader article on it, that it should be saved. Then I spoke to Dr. David Owen, who was associated with Lundy, the saving of Lundy Island, and he also was involved, or at least had given his blessing to the project to bring back the Great Britain as Under Secretary of State for the Navy. And that's when I was introduced to Mr. Richard Gould Adams and Dr. Ewan Corlett, and from that moment onwards it was sort of all systems go, I think.
The next step is a detailed technical survey, including a salvage survey and formulation of plans in detail for the floating, repair and tow home.
By pure chance, the dry dock in which she was built still existed, lying virtually unused in Bristol. The Wapping dock was the perfect place for the Great Britain to come back to, if they could bring her, and if the new dock gate had still enough width for her to pass through. This template was built to exactly the same shape as the widest part of the ship's hull. Dr. Corlett watched as they got the template into exactly the right place and measured the space.
12.5 inches.
That's right.
Less than a foot, but enough. She was still a wreck in the Falklands, but the plans to save her were beginning to work out. It had become pretty obvious that towing the Great Britain right across the Atlantic was going to require some very large and very modern equipment. In March this year, a strange convoy crossed the Atlantic and dropped anchor in Sparrow Cove, right alongside the Great Britain. Towed by an ocean-going tug, the Mulus is a floating pontoon of 2,500 tons. To understand their plan is simple. To see how they could carry it out is quite another matter. The plan was to put the Great Britain on top of the Mulus and tow them both back to Britain as one complete unit. And to do that, they had two separate teams of men. Leslie O'Neill was in charge of floating the Great Britain, also responsible for all the pumps and gear sent out to repair the hull and get it off the beach. Horst Cowlin was in charge of the pontoon, and incidentally it was his job to lower the great spar still remaining, and also the three enormous wooden masts. It is hard to appreciate just how big these masts are until you see the size of a man in relation to them. In fact, they're the biggest wooden masts ever built. They had to cut the yard away with an oxyacetylene torch because the metal parts holding it up had rusted solid. Now this spar weighs over 8 tons. It's 105 feet long, and if they made a mistake and it dropped, the whole project would be over because it would cut the ship virtually in half. While the spar came gently down, and while they prepared to lift out the masts, it was time for the divers to get under her stern and start patching the holes made when she was beached in 1937. From inside, it looks a fairly impossible task. But they used a very simple system. They cut sheets of ordinary plywood so that they would fit and overlap the holes. These sheets were drilled and bolted through to clamps attached on the inside of the ship. Of course, plywood isn't strong enough on its own, but once in place, it's no very great problem to cover the whole area and bury the holes with a patch made out of good, strong concrete. The plan worked well, and within a matter of hours, where the sea had been surging in and out, the hull was completely watertight. This part, at any rate. The sheer legs were up and attached, and they were ready to start lifting. Take into account that the step of a mast like this is placed well down inside the ship, and a lot of mast has to be lifted out before they can swing it clear and over the side. They had refurbished that deck house themselves as somewhere comfortable to eat their breakfast. That was only the small mizzenmast, and that might easily have been a lot worse if somebody had been in the way. The mainmast, probably the biggest wooden mast in the world, weighs 30 tons. Horst decided that discretion was the better part of getting home in one piece, and gave orders for a chainsaw to be obtained and the mast cut off just above the level of the deck. They attached the hoist, and then with just enough lift on the winches to hold it upright, they began to cut away the metal stays. They were hoping for just enough wind to blow it in the right direction. Of course, when they wanted it, the wind died, and the mast stayed resolutely upright. So they hammered in wedges instead. Two down and one to go. The Great Britain was built with 6 masts. During her career, she lost 3 of them in 40 years, finishing up as a 3-masted ship. Now she was to lose her other 3 masts in less than a week. With the hull now lighter by many tons, the job of getting the ship afloat became a good deal easier. Nevertheless, the prospect of putting one of these 2 giant objects on top of the other still looked like a formidable task. The system basically required that the Great Britain should float while the Mulus should sink. Then, with the Great Britain exactly over the top of the Mulus, they could refloat the pontoon. Only to do it, the Great Britain had to float, and to achieve that, they had to close the crack. They used a system as old as Trafalgar, and probably a lot older than that. With plywood put across the face of the crack, they lowered mattresses into the water, hauled them down, and stuffed them, one after the other, into the open space. Now you may wonder why they didn't use concrete like they did with the holes in the stern. But the crack is different. If the ship floats, instead of lying on an uneven bed of sand and rock, she'll be supported evenly all the way along. The gap should close and the mattresses will be trapped, making a watertight joint. They were now getting nearer the critical stage. These great steel plates were measured, cut and fixed into the structure of the ship across the split. The idea being that when she floats and the gap closes, they can tighten up the bolts and hold her together so that the gap can never open up again. And so it started at last. While everyone was praying that the water was coming out quicker than it was going in, they moved the Mulus to a spot some distance away where the bottom was exactly the right depth, and here they began the most enormous disappearing trick. Using the chart made by the crew of Endurance, they found one place where the bottom was level and the water was exactly the right depth. The important thing was to make sure that the Mulus was placed exactly over this one possible spot. Finally, they opened the air vents in the great buoyancy tanks, and like a vast submarine submerging, the Mulus, complete with its gear, its winches and everything else, slid below the surface and settled gently and firmly on the bottom. With its tall metal poles sticking out of the water, the spot was marked exactly for the Great Britain to float over the top of the Mulus. The question still was, would the Great Britain float tomorrow? The tug lay off in deeper water for the night, and they waited. It should have happened the next day. Quite suddenly, when no one was expecting it, and with hardly a wire made fast to hold her, she was up. The Great Britain was afloat again. They found wires just in time, and they made her safe before she floated away. With a small tug alongside her, they were ready for the last stage, in some ways the most difficult of all. To get this great, rusty, leaking monster exactly in the right place on top of the Mulus, taking into account that she may be floating now, but nobody knows how much damage she may have underneath, and nobody knows how strong she is. She could simply sink where she is at any moment. They flew the ensign of the Falkland Islands from her stern, and very slowly they nudged her, a foot at a time this way, and an inch at a time that way. It's no easy task to move a big ship like the Great Britain in the open sea onto a spot so exact that the matter of inches makes the difference between success and failure. Finally, they were satisfied. She was over the top, and the next stage could begin. Horst Carlin, the salvage engineer, explains how they did it.
The pontoon was now full up with water and stay flat on the ground. And the Great Britain was refloating and come now inside between the dolphins on the right position on the pontoon. And now we start with air pump inside in the bow from the pontoon. And after 3 hours, maybe, come the pontoon up with the Great Britain. After 12 or 15 hours more, the airs come over the middle from the pontoon, and that was a difficult point when the pontoon start and will come free from the bottom. And we watch it with divers what side come first, and so it was on one side more, and so we bring more air on this side, and the pontoon come back and come just free from the bottom now. So it was easy to bring up and the Great Britain together. And after 24 hours, the pontoon was free out the water, and now we have to bring all water out, check all tanks, new around the pontoon, and now he's swimming safety is no less.
She was actually standing there, high and dry, out of the water, and yet afloat. On the 14th of April, the Great Britain left Sparrow Cove. She sailed out and round the corner and back into Port Stanley. A dramatic sight for the islanders, and particularly for the men who took her the other way as a hulk back in 1937. There were some who said that it couldn't be done, and some who were sure that it shouldn't be done. There were very few indeed who thought that it would ever actually happen, but it did. The Great Britain was back in harbour, temporarily. They welded her down onto the pontoon. They attached wires and hauled them tight. They put in wedges and props. They fastened down so securely that she became part of the pontoon itself. Nothing was going to move her now that they had her aboard. It's a long way from the Falkland Islands to Bristol, about 9,000 miles in fact, a very long way to come home. But at least she was underway. Whatever happened, she wasn't going to end her days as a heap of rusty metal on a beach in the Falkland Islands. It isn't easy to keep control over a flat pontoon when you're towing it across the Atlantic on the end of a wire rope. At one stage, the tow became so difficult that they only covered 30 miles in 24 hours. As you will have gathered by now, a lot of very highly skilled men had already been involved in the operation, and the crew of the tug were no exception. They spent 49 days at sea, towing at about 5 knots. But on the 23rd of June they arrived, just down the river from Bristol at Avonmouth. With a fleet of ships and small boats coming to meet her, she came safely into calm water and moved slowly towards the lock gates. And you might easily imagine that with her safely inside the lock and out of the sea, the problems were over at last. But they weren't. Certainly, here in this great dock, she was safe for the moment. Apart from her Falkland Island ensign, she had brought with her a lot of problems, not only for Dr. Corlett and the Great Britain Project Committee, but also for the men who were planning how to get her back into the water and up the river to Bristol. Getting her off the pontoon turned out to be quite a problem, but in just over a week they were ready, despite the wind, which didn't help anybody. The pontoon lay empty again, and in the very early morning they started.
All right, that'll do, Warren.
With a Bristol pilot controlling the whole operation, and with the 2 Port of Bristol tugs, one behind and one in front, she was nudged, eased and persuaded out of the dock at Avonmouth and into the river, ready to be towed very gently on the flood tide towards Bristol. Remember when you watch this operation that there's no way of steering her apart from the 2 tugs. With the Royal Naval Escort in front to lead her, she started 7 miles of one of the trickiest rivers that any reasonable-sized ship could attempt to navigate. Just one slight error of judgment or one mistaken command, and in this river she could go aground in a matter of seconds. Already the river has become very narrow, and the worst part by far is just coming into view. Horseshoe Bend is notoriously difficult. With a crosswind and strong currents, this is the place where the tugs proved that they knew exactly what they were doing.
Easy for it now, don't put any weight on her, let the steering go out.
With a rise and fall in the tide of 39 feet, just one touch on the mud would be disaster. They took her close into the bank, pulled her steadily round, and without any fuss at all, she was through. As she came up on this early Sunday morning, it was obvious that a lot of people were going to be there to meet her. 100,000 people from all over Britain, lining the bank and crowding the famous Clifton Suspension Bridge, built by Brunel himself, the same man who had designed the Great Britain. They had got up at crack of dawn to see Brunel's ship sail under Brunel's bridge. It was the greatest moment of the whole journey. She came up to the lock right in the middle of Bristol. They brought her through the narrow opening without even touching the sides. And with Dr. Corlett himself on board, she came home after 127 years. The salvage crew had completed a brilliant operation. And Jack Hayward was there to meet her, ready to celebrate with Dr. Corlett almost the end of the voyage. But not quite the end. There was still one more stage to go. They had to wait another 2 weeks to complete the whole operation. In fact, they had to wait for a high spring tide to give them enough water to float the Great Britain back into the small dock in which she had been built. As it happened, the right tide was on the evening of July the 19th, exactly 127 years after she had been floated out for the first time with Prince Albert in attendance. This time, Prince Philip was aboard to see her get back, at least to see if it was possible. He knew, just as the men in charge knew, that if the water didn't make as much as everybody expected, and it can happen, then she wouldn't go through the gate. At most, she'd have less than a foot of water under her keel at the gate, and there was less than 20 minutes of high tide in which to get her through. They swung her across the river, passed the lines to the dockers on shore, and waited.
Hey! Go ahead, driver.
They brought her stern right up to the gates. For Leslie O'Neill, who had been in charge of floating her off the beach, just as much as for the dockers themselves, it was a nasty moment. She might easily stick halfway through the gates, and if she did, would break in half like a matchstick. The water rose, and the ship rose with it. 3 inches, 2 inches, 1 inch to go. Just enough water to slide her over. Everyone was watching the mark on the side of the dock.
Just easy on the... Easy. Just keep your slack up, let her drift back.
If the calculations and the measurements were right, there should be 7 inches of water over the sill and under the keel. But remember, there are over 300 feet of keel that have to pass. Dr. Corlett's template had given them 7.5 inches on either side. Without even room for the mussel shells, she scraped slowly in.
All right, we'll let her drift for a minute, mate. Run your other rope up, Ken. Slack away on your quarter rope, you run him up.
And apart from the shouting, that is really the end of the story. A story that took 127 years to the day. Perhaps at the end, the strangest thing is the amount of money and the amount of work that have been given to bringing home 3,000 tons of rusting iron. The fantastic amount of trouble that's been taken, and the extraordinary interest that has been shown. Why have these men bothered? Why did Prince Philip come to see for himself? Surely, for the answer, you have to go back to Bristol 127 years ago. The ship that Brunel designed and built was intended to be the finest passenger ship in the world. The hulk that was floated back to Bristol and closed into the lock represents not only a great ship, but also the genius of a great engineer. The Great Britain was everything that Brunel intended and more. Restored or not, there stands there now in Bristol one of the finest ships ever built by anybody, anywhere in the world.